The tape was rolling, but nobody was breathing. Inside Cosimo Matassa's studio on that humid September afternoon in 1955, Little Richard had just finished the first take of a song that would either revolutionize rock and roll or end his career before it even started. The producers, white men in pressed shirts who'd recorded everyone from Fats Domino to Professor Longhair, stood behind the glass with their hands over their mouths, and it wasn't because of the music's power, it was because of the words. The original lyrics to Tutti Frutti were so sexually charged, so openly about the queer underground culture of the Chitlin Circuit, so explicitly about things that couldn't be said on American radio in 1955, that playing them would mean instant banishment from every station in the country. Little Richard didn't care. He'd been singing these words in roadhouses and juke joints for years, watched men and women alike lose their minds to the barely concealed meanings, felt the power of finally saying out loud what society demanded stay hidden. But the men behind the glass cared, and they had 15 minutes to save rock and roll from itself. Before we dive deeper into what happened in that studio, if you're fascinated by the untold stories of music legends and the moments that changed history forever, hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what comes next. The original sin of rock and roll. To understand what happened on September 14, 1955, you have to understand who Little Richard Penniman was before that day, and more importantly, what he'd been forced to hide for 22 years. Born Richard Wayne Penniman on December 5, 1932 in Macon, Georgia, he grew up in a world that had very specific ideas about what a black man should be, how he should act, who he should love. The problem was that Richard didn't fit any of those boxes. From the time he could walk, he moved differently, spoke differently, felt things differently. His family noticed, the neighborhood noticed, and in the Jim Crow South, being noticed for being different could get you killed. His father, Bud Penniman, ran a tavern and sold bootleg whiskey, a hard man who'd fought his way through Georgia's brutal racial landscape and expected his son to do the same. But young Richard gravitated toward his mother's Pentecostal church, drawn not just to the music but to the ecstatic expression, the emotional release, the way you could lose yourself completely in praise and nobody questioned it. He watched the women in church, studied how they moved, how they dressed, how they expressed joy and pain without apologizing for either. Something in him recognized something in them, a freedom he desperately wanted but couldn't name. By the time he was 13, the tension in the Penniman household had reached a breaking point. Richard wasn't just effeminate, he was openly experimenting with makeup, wearing his mother's clothes when his father wasn't home, performing in ways that couldn't be explained away as childhood play. One night in 1945, his father Bud Penniman made a decision that would haunt both of them for the rest of their lives. He kicked Richard out, not temporarily, not as punishment, forever. The words witnesses later recalled were clear: he'd rather have no son than a homosexual son. Richard, barely a teenager, found himself on the streets of Macon with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. What happened next shaped everything about the Little Richard the world would eventually know. He found refuge in Ann Johnson's establishment on Macon's Pleasant Hill district, a place that operated as part boarding house, part club, part brothel. Ann Johnson, a large woman with a generous heart and a pragmatic view of survival, took Richard in. But more importantly, she introduced him to a world he'd never known existed, an underground community of performers, sex workers, drag queens and musicians who lived openly as themselves behind closed doors. The women there taught him makeup techniques. The drag performers showed him how to transform, how to use performance as both shield and sword. The musicians, piano players who could make an upright sing like it was possessed, showed him that you could pour all that forbidden energy, all that suppressed sexuality, all that rage and joy and confusion into music, and people would pay to feel it. For the next several years, Richard performed wherever he could: talent shows, medicine shows, traveling minstrel troupes. He absorbed everything: gospel fervor from the church, rhythm and blues from the juke joints, the wild performance style of performers like Escarita and Billy Wright, who wore makeup and processed hair and didn't apologize for it. But during all this time, Richard was developing something else, a repertoire of songs with double meanings, lyrics that seemed innocent on the surface but carried coded messages for those who knew how to listen. Songs about desires that couldn't be spoken plainly, about experiences that had no place in polite society, about a way of being that 1940s and 50s America insisted didn't exist. The Chitlin Circuit underground. By the early 1950s, Little Richard had become a fixture on the Chitlin Circuit, that network of clubs, theaters and juke joints across the South where black performers could work. But even within that world, Richard was different. Most performers played it relatively safe, knowing that even black audiences had limits to what they'd accept. Richard pushed those limits every single night. He'd wear eyeliner and mascara, pile his hair high with pomade until it defied gravity, scream and moan and pound that piano like he was trying to break through to another dimension. And the songs were barely concealed explosions of sexuality. Tutti Frutti was the crown jewel of this repertoire, though it wasn't called that yet. The version Richard performed in the clubs had different lyrics, words that left nothing to imagination about what he was singing about. Club owners loved it because it packed the houses. Audiences loved it because it gave voice to things they felt but couldn't say. Richard loved it because for 3 minutes, he could be completely unapologetically himself. The song became his signature, the one that got the wildest response, the one that made him feel most alive. But it was also the song that could never ever be played on the radio as it existed. Then came 1954, and everything started shifting. A white singer from Memphis named Elvis Presley recorded That's All Right, and suddenly the music industry was waking up to something they'd been sleeping on. There was massive money to be made if you could somehow package black music for white teenagers. Record labels started scouring the South, looking for the next big thing. Specialty Records, a small Los Angeles-based label owned by Art Roop, had already had success with gospel and rhythm and blues. Roop sent a talent scout named Robert Blackwell, known as Bumps to everyone in the business, to New Orleans to find new artists. Bumps Blackwell changes everything. Bumps Blackwell was different from most A&R men in the music business. First, he was black, which meant he could move through spaces and communities that white record executives couldn't access. Second, he actually respected the artists, saw them as creative partners rather than commodities to exploit. Third, and most importantly for Richard's story, Bumps understood coded language. He'd grown up in the same world Richard had, knew the underground cultures, recognized the double meanings and hidden messages that flew over most people's heads. When he first saw Little Richard perform at the Dewdrop Inn in New Orleans in 1955, he immediately understood two things. This was the most talented performer he'd ever seen, and this performer was absolutely unemployable by conventional industry standards. Richard was attacking that piano like it had personally offended him, his processed hair flying, makeup running with sweat, screaming lyrics that made the mostly black audience lose their collective minds. The energy in the room was sexual, dangerous, ecstatic, everything that white America in 1955 was terrified of. After the show, Bumps went backstage and found Richard wiping off his makeup, getting ready to do it all again for the late show. They talked for 2 hours. Richard was suspicious at first. He'd been burned by record companies before, had made records that went nowhere while the labels pocketed the money. But Bumps made him an offer. Come to Cosimo Matassa's studio in New Orleans, and we'll record you doing exactly what you do. No changes, no compromises, just pure Little Richard. Richard agreed, but with a condition. He wanted to record Tutti Frutti as he performed it in the clubs. Bumps hesitated. He knew that song, had heard Richard do it at the Dewdrop. He knew there was no way in hell any radio station would play it with those lyrics. But he also knew that if you stripped away what made Richard special, if you cleaned him up too much, you'd kill the very thing that made him extraordinary. So Bumps said yes, figuring they'd deal with the lyrics problem when they got to it. September 14th, 1955. The session was scheduled for early afternoon, but Richard showed up at noon, too excited to wait. Cosimo Matassa's studio on North Rampart Street was tiny, cramped, with barely enough room for the piano, drums, bass and horn section Bumps had assembled. The studio had a reputation. Everyone from Fats Domino to Guitar Slim had recorded there. But it was far from glamorous. The August heat made the small space feel like an oven, even with the windows open. Richard sat at the upright piano testing the keys, running through riffs while the other musicians set up. What nobody knew, what Richard hadn't told anyone, was that he'd been up all night, unable to sleep, going over and over in his mind whether to perform the song as he'd been doing it for years or to water it down for the record. Part of him wanted to finally capture on tape what he really did, what really moved audiences. Another part understood that this might be his only shot at breaking through to a wider audience, and if he blew it by being too explicit, he might never get another chance. By the time he walked into that studio, he'd made his decision. He was going to do it exactly as he'd always done it, and let the chips fall where they fell. The tape started rolling. Richard counted off, the band came in, and then that voice, that impossible gender-defying, ceiling-shattering voice erupted. The piano thundered, the horns blasted, and Richard screamed lyrics that were so sexually explicit, so openly queer, so completely outside the boundaries of acceptable 1950s discourse that the engineers physically recoiled. Cosimo looked at Bumps. Bumps looked at the ceiling. The song was incredible, the energy, the joy, the raw power was undeniable. It was also completely, utterly impossible to release. When the take ended, nobody said anything for a long moment. Richard, breathing hard, sweat soaking through his shirt, looked up at the control booth expectantly. He knew what he'd done. He'd thrown down a gauntlet. This is who I am, take it or leave it. Bumps pressed the intercom button. His voice was careful, measured. Richard, that was something else, but we need to talk about those lyrics. Richard's face fell. He'd known this was coming, but hoping and knowing are different things. He stood up from the piano, wiped his face with a towel, and waited for what he knew came next. The compromise, the sellout, the moment where who he really was got traded away for who they needed him to be. Dorothy LaBostrie's 14 minutes. Here's where the story takes a turn that nobody saw coming. Bumps had planned for this contingency, sort of. He'd invited a young local songwriter named Dorothy LaBostrie to the session, figuring they might need help polishing some lyrics. Dorothy was known around New Orleans for her ability to write clean, catchy lyrics that could get radio play. She was also one of the few women working in the male-dominated session writing world, sharp and quick and unflappable. But nothing in her career had prepared her for what she was about to hear. Bumps called Dorothy into the control booth and played her the take. Her eyes widened, then widened more. By the end, she was shaking her head in disbelief. "You can't put that out," she said flatly. "Not one station in this country will play it, not one." Bumps nodded. "I know, but the music is perfect. The energy is perfect. We just need different words that keep that same feeling." Dorothy laughed, a short, sharp bark of disbelief. "Keep the same feeling? That feeling is what the words are about. You take away what he's actually saying, you're taking away why it hits so hard." But she was a professional. She understood the game. The question was whether it was even possible to clean up Tutti Frutti enough for mainstream consumption without killing what made it special. She asked Bumps to play the take again, then again. She was listening for something. The melody, the rhythm, the spaces where new words could fit. Meanwhile, Richard was in the studio, pacing like a caged animal. He could see them through the glass, talking intensely, occasionally glancing his way. He knew what was happening. They were trying to figure out how to save the song by changing everything about it. The clock was ticking. Studio time was expensive, and they had other songs to record. The other musicians were getting restless, wondering if they should take a break or keep waiting. Dorothy LaBostrie took a notepad and a pencil and sat in the corner of the control booth. She started writing. Fast, what Dorothy did in the next 14 minutes was nothing short of miraculous. She kept the structure of Richard's original, kept the feeling, kept the barely contained wildness, but changed the words to something that could theoretically be played on the radio. The famous "A-wop bopaloo bopalop bam boom" opening, that was hers. A string of nonsense syllables that somehow captured the same chaotic energy as Richard's original explicitly sexual opening. She kept references to Tutti Frutti and Good Booty, but made them ambiguous enough that they could be interpreted as innocent or not depending on who was listening. The genius was that she gave Richard room to interpret the lyrics with his voice, his inflection, his performance style. On paper the words were safe. In Richard's throat they could still be dangerous. She handed the rewritten lyrics to Bumps. He read them, nodded slowly, then handed them to Richard through the studio door. Richard looked at the paper for a long time. Everyone watched his face, trying to read his reaction. This was the moment. Would he accept the compromise, or would he walk away, insisting on artistic purity even if it meant commercial suicide? Richard read the words once, twice, 3 times. Then he did something nobody expected. He laughed. Not a bitter laugh, not a defeated laugh, but a genuine laugh of appreciation. Dorothy had pulled off something clever. She'd given him a Trojan horse. The lyrics looked innocent, but the way they were structured, the way they could be performed, left room for all the subtext and innuendo Richard wanted to pack in. It was coded language, the same thing he'd been using his whole life to survive in a world that demanded he hide. The difference was, now it was going on a record. Richard went back to the piano. Dorothy came down from the control booth to work with him on the phrasing, making sure the new words fit the melody naturally. They rehearsed it a few times, Richard trying different approaches, finding the pockets where he could push a little harder, where he could let his voice do what his words couldn't say explicitly. This time there was a different feeling in the room, not the tension of the first take, but a sense of possibility. The tape rolled again. Richard launched into the new version, and something magical happened. The cleaned-up lyrics actually gave him more freedom, not less. Because the words weren't explicitly sexual, he could go even harder with his voice, his delivery, his piano playing. He could scream and moan, and make those keys sound like they were being assaulted, and it read as musical excitement rather than sexual expression. The famous falsetto whoa that became his trademark. In this version, it sounded like pure musical exuberance. But if you knew what you were listening for, if you understood the codes, you could still hear everything Richard had originally meant to say. The song was a masterpiece of misdirection, saying everything by saying nothing. When the take ended, everyone in the room knew they had something special. Cosimo was grinning. The musicians were nodding, exchanging glances that said, "Did we just make what I think we just made?" Bumps pressed the intercom button. "Richard, that's it, that's the one." Richard stood up from the piano, straightened his shirt, ran a hand through his processed hair. He looked exhausted, but exhilarated. They'd done it. They'd found a way to capture what he did without completely neutering it. It wasn't exactly what he'd wanted to record, but it was close enough, and more importantly, it might actually get played on the radio. The aftermath nobody expected. Tutti Frutti was released in November 1955 on Specialty Records. Art Rupi, listening to the final master in Los Angeles, had been cautiously optimistic. It was certainly different from anything else on the radio, but different didn't always mean successful. The initial pressing was small, just a few thousand copies, distributed primarily to black radio stations in the South. What happened next shocked everyone, including Little Richard himself. The song exploded. Not slowly, not gradually, but like a bomb going off. Within 2 weeks it was the most requested song on black radio stations from Atlanta to Chicago. DJs played it constantly, and listeners couldn't get enough. But then something even more unexpected happened. White teenagers started calling white radio stations asking for it. This wasn't supposed to happen. Rock and roll was still largely segregated in 1955, with white covers of black songs being the primary way black music reached white audiences. But white kids had heard Tutti Frutti somehow, and they wanted more. White radio station program directors faced a dilemma. The song was undeniably catchy, and the requests were overwhelming. But it was also undeniably black, undeniably wild, undeniably something that challenged every assumption about what was appropriate for white teenagers to listen to. Some stations banned it outright, others played it late at night, but many more than anyone predicted added it to regular rotation. By January 1956, Tutti Frutti had sold over 500,000 copies. Little Richard suddenly found himself with a hit record and booking offers from major venues. But success came with complications. Pat Boone, the clean-cut white singer who specialized in sanitized covers of black songs, recorded his version in December 1955. His version removed every trace of wildness, every hint of danger. It was Tutti Frutti as white America wished it could be, safe, muted, completely non-threatening. Boone sang it like a pleasant pop song, standing still in front of the microphone in his white buck shoes, and it sold even more than Richard's original, reaching number 12 on the pop charts, while Richard's version struggled to cross over beyond number 17 on rhythm and blues charts. Richard was furious but pragmatic. The Boone cover meant more royalties, more exposure. Still, the injustice stung. The hidden cost of compromise. The compromise Richard made in that studio set a pattern that would define his entire career. He'd learned he could have commercial success if he hid part of himself, if he coded his messages carefully. It worked financially and professionally. Tutti Frutti opened doors that would have stayed closed. Over the next 2 years, Little Richard released a string of hits, Long Tall Sally, Rip It Up, Lucille, Good Golly Miss Molly, that defined early rock and roll. He became one of the first black rock and roll stars to achieve widespread crossover success. He influenced everyone from Elvis Presley to Buddy Holly to James Brown. But the psychological cost was immense. Richard had spent his childhood hiding who he was. Tutti Frutti was supposed to be the moment where he got to be himself publicly. Instead, it became another place where he had to hide, code, compromise. In every performance, every interview, Richard had to maintain the careful balance he'd struck that September day. He could be wild, but not too wild. He could be flamboyant, but couldn't explicitly say what that flamboyance meant. By 1957, the pressure was unbearable. Richard was at the peak of commercial success, but the disconnect between his public persona and private reality was tearing him apart. On stage, he was the wild man of rock and roll. Backstage, he was increasingly turning to drugs and alcohol. And in his quietest moments, he was haunted by the Pentecostal faith that taught him everything he was doing was sinful. The Australian tour in October 1957 broke something in him. Richard had some kind of spiritual crisis. Some accounts say he saw an airplane engine catch fire and interpreted it as a sign from God. Others say it was exhaustion and guilt reaching a breaking point. Whatever the trigger, the result was dramatic. Richard decided to quit rock and roll entirely. The announcement shocked the music world. He enrolled in Oakwood College to study theology. He renounced rock and roll as the devil's music. He married Ernestine Campbell in what looked like an attempt to live conventionally heterosexual. The cycle that never ended. But walking away didn't solve his fundamental problem. The marriage was troubled from the start. Richard's attraction to men didn't disappear. The part of him that loved performing didn't disappear either. Ernestine grew increasingly frustrated. They separated after 3 years. By 1962, Richard was performing again. First in England, where the Beatles worshipped him. Paul McCartney studied Richard's vocal style obsessively. John Lennon watched how Richard commanded a stage. Richard taught them everything he knew. But watching the Beatles achieve the mainstream success that had always been just out of his reach hurt in ways he couldn't articulate. Being back on stage awakened everything Richard had tried to suppress, and the cycle began. Perform, feel guilty, promise to quit, perform again. This cycle would define the rest of his life. He'd embrace rock and roll, then renounce it for religion. Each time, the push and pull between his secular and sacred selves would tear him apart. He'd give interviews claiming homosexuality was wrong and he'd been cured, then give different interviews talking about his attractions to men. The compromise he'd made in 1955 had become the template for his entire existence. The true legacy. Little Richard died on May 9, 2020, at age 87. Obituaries celebrated him as a founding father of rock and roll, but they missed the deeper story. The compromise Richard made that day wasn't just about one song. It was about the fundamental bargain that queer artists, particularly queer black artists, were forced to make in mid-century America. You could be yourself in the margins, but if you wanted mainstream success, you had to hide. Little Richard navigated this impossible space better than almost anyone, which is both his triumph and his tragedy. He proved that a flamboyant, gender-non-conforming black man could become a rock and roll star. He influenced generations. Prince, David Bowie, Freddie Mercury, Michael Jackson all owed him a debt, but the cost was his own peace of mind. Richard never fully reconciled the different parts of himself. What really happened in that studio? So what really happened on September 14, 1955? In that studio, in those 15 minutes, we see the impossible choices that marginalized artists have always faced. Be yourself and be rejected, or modify yourself and be accepted. Speak your truth plainly and be silenced, or code your truth carefully and be heard. Little Richard chose to make the compromise. Because he made that choice, millions heard Tutti Frutti. Rock and roll reached across racial and social barriers. Popular culture became a little bit queerer, a little bit blacker, a little bit wilder. But Richard himself remained split, never quite whole, forever torn between the person he was before Dorothy LaBostrie rewrote those lyrics and the person he became after. When you listen to Tutti Frutti now, you're hearing both things at once, the joy and the compromise, the breakthrough and the hiding, the revolution and its cost. You're hearing a young man who wanted desperately to be himself, discovering that being himself fully wasn't an option the world was willing to give him. So he took what he could get, put on the mask and screamed into the microphone with everything he had. Sometimes you can hear it beneath the cleaned-up lyrics, the real Little Richard, the one who walked into Cosimo's studio ready to tell his truth before the world told him it was too much. That ghost of authenticity echoes through every performance, every recording, every moment of Little Richard's extraordinary and heartbreaking career. The tape kept rolling, history was made, and somewhere in those grooves is everything we gained and everything we lost when Little Richard learned to hide in plain sight. That's the real story of Tutti Frutti. That's what happened on September 14th, 1955. That's the song beneath the song.